In downtown Brooklyn's BlitzMMA, a seemingly humble visitor was about to face public humiliation. A routine gym observation turned deadly when an arrogant trainer began setting up cameras to mock the legend. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical Hollywood has-been. For over 4 decades, he was a legitimate aikido master and martial arts philosopher, known for teaching that true strength never needs to prove itself. When Blitz Carter orchestrated his calculated ambush livestream, he had no idea. He was walking into a masterclass in humility. Seagal's patient responses that would trigger a complete transformation of everyone who witnessed it. What began as a social media setup would become a profound lesson in what real mastery looks like. The BlitzMMA community would never be the same after discovering that the most dangerous opponent is the one who doesn't need to fight. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of BlitzMMA in downtown Brooklyn, each drop catching the neon glow of the gym's signature logo. Inside, the evening crowd was thinning out, leaving only the most dedicated athletes and the youth self-defense class wrapping up in the back corner. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and determination, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of heavy bags and the occasional grunt of exertion. Through the glass doors stepped a figure that seemed to emerge from the rain itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark trench coat with a baseball cap pulled low over weathered features. Steven Seagal moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled motion. His steps were silent on the polished concrete floor, each movement economical and purposeful. Behind the reception desk, Lexi Rivera looked up from her laptop where she'd been editing promotional footage for the gym's social media accounts. At 24, she had the keen eye of someone who saw stories in everyday moments, her film school training having taught her to recognize when something significant was about to unfold. The camera instinctively came to her hand as she watched the stranger approach. "Evening," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had once commanded movie screens worldwide. "I'm Steven. I called earlier about observing the youth class." Yasmin Farouk emerged from her office, her compact frame moving with the confident stride of someone who had built this empire from nothing. At 45, she carried herself with the no-nonsense bearing of a former pro boxer, her dark eyes assessing every situation with tactical precision. She extended a calloused hand. "Mr. Seagal, welcome to BlitzMMA. I have to say, I wasn't sure you'd actually show up." Her tone was respectful but cautious, the wariness of someone who had learned to be skeptical of celebrities seeking attention. "I keep my word," Seagal replied simply, accepting the handshake. "The work you're doing with at-risk youth, that matters more than most things." Across the gym, 12-year-old Mike Santiago was attempting to perfect a defensive stance under the watchful eye of assistant trainer Raina Brooks. The kid's concentration was absolute, his small frame mimicking the movements with the seriousness of someone who knew these skills might save his life someday. When he caught sight of the figure in the trench coat, his eyes went wide. "Holy shit," he whispered, then immediately clapped a hand over his mouth as Raina shot him a warning look. "Language, Mike," she said, but her own attention was drawn to the visitor. Raina's military background had taught her to read people quickly, and something about this man's presence commanded instant respect. The way he moved, the way he observed. This wasn't someone seeking attention. "Is that really him?" Mike's voice was barely audible, but his excitement was palpable. "My uncle showed me all his movies. He said he was the real deal." Lexi had moved closer now, her camera capturing the subtle dynamics playing out across the gym. Through her lens, she watched as Seagal removed his coat and cap, revealing the familiar features that had once made him one of Hollywood's most recognizable action stars. But this wasn't the theatrical persona from the movies. This was something quieter, more authentic. From the main training area, Blitz Carter noticed the commotion. At 28, Blake was the gym's head trainer and social media sensation, his perfectly sculpted physique and aggressive training style having earned him over 2 million followers across platforms. He paused mid-rep on his bench press, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the visitor. Well, Blake muttered to his cameraman Dev Malik, who was adjusting lighting for their evening training session. Looks like we got ourselves some vintage entertainment. Dev, a thoughtful 26-year-old who had grown up with Blake in the same tough neighborhood, felt a familiar unease in his stomach. He'd seen that look in his friend's eyes before, the predatory gleam that appeared whenever Blake sensed an opportunity for content that would drive engagement. Maybe we should just let the man do his thing, Dev suggested quietly, but Blake was already moving toward the reception area, his performance smile sliding into place. Steven Seagal. Blake's voice boomed across the gym, drawing the attention of everyone present. Man, this is wild. Blake Carter, head trainer here at BlitzMMA. Huge fan of your work, especially the early stuff. The handshake Blake offered was deliberately aggressive, the kind of grip meant to establish dominance. Seagal accepted it with calm indifference, neither competing nor yielding, simply present. I appreciate that, Seagal said. I'm just here to observe. Yasmin mentioned you do excellent work with the youth program. Oh, we do more than excellent, Blake replied, his chest puffing slightly. We're revolutionizing how these kids learn to defend themselves. Real techniques for real situations, not the theatrical stuff from the movies, you know? The subtle dig hung in the air like smoke. Yasmin's jaw tightened slightly, but Seagal's expression remained unchanged. If he caught the insult, he chose not to acknowledge it. Every approach has its place, Seagal said simply. May I observe the class? As the group moved toward the youth training area, Lexi continued filming, her documentarian instincts fully engaged. She could sense the undercurrents flowing between the personalities, Blake's barely concealed agenda, Yasmin's protective concern for her gym's reputation, Raina's quiet professionalism, and Seagal's enigmatic presence that seemed to draw both respect and skepticism. Mike Santiago had positioned himself where he could steal glances at the legendary action star, his usual focus on training replaced by wide-eyed fascination. When Seagal caught his eye and offered a subtle nod of acknowledgement, the boy's face lit up with a grin that could have powered the entire gym. Tomorrow, Blake said as they reached the training mats, his voice carrying just loud enough for Dev's camera to catch. You should come back. I'm doing a special session on modern defensive techniques. Would love to get your thoughts on how the art has evolved. The invitation sounded gracious on the surface, but Lexi's camera caught the calculating gleam in Blake's eyes. She'd seen enough of his social media strategy sessions to recognize when he was setting up content. This wasn't about honoring a legend. This was about building a platform for mockery. I'd be honored, Seagal replied, seemingly oblivious to the trap being set. Teaching the next generation is always worthwhile. As the rain continued to streak down the windows, the gym settled into its evening rhythm. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a tension that promised confrontation. Lexi saved her footage and made a mental note to return tomorrow with extra batteries. Whatever Blake was planning, she had a feeling it would be worth documenting. The stage was set, the players in position. In less than 24 hours, a quiet evening at BlitzMMA would become something none of them would ever forget. The next evening arrived with the same Brooklyn drizzle, but inside BlitzMMA, the energy was electric. Blake had spent the day promoting his special guest appearance across his social media channels, teasing his followers with cryptic hints about old school meets new school and legendary showdown. By the time Seagal arrived, precisely at the agreed-upon time, the gym was buzzing with anticipation. Dev had set up multiple camera angles, his technical expertise ensuring every moment would be captured in crisp detail. Despite his growing unease about Blake's intentions, he was a professional, and his loyalty to his childhood friend ran deep. Still, as he adjusted the final lighting setup, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to cross a line. Chat, we are live. Blake's voice boomed through the gym as he positioned himself in front of the main camera. Welcome back to BlitzMMA, where we separate the real from the theatrical. Tonight, we have a very special guest, a man who needs no introduction, though his techniques might need some updating. The live viewer count was climbing rapidly, comments flooding in from Blake's devoted followers. Lexi positioned herself discreetly in the background, her own camera rolling as she documented what she increasingly suspected would be a pivotal moment. Seagal entered wearing simple black pants and a dark polo shirt, his movements still carrying that same deliberate grace from the night before. He acknowledged Blake with a polite nod and took in the elaborate setup with mild interest but no apparent concern. Steven Seagal, ladies and gentlemen, Blake announced, gesturing dramatically. Aikido master, action movie legend, and tonight's guest instructor. The comments section exploded with a mix of excitement and skepticism. Lexi watched the feed on her phone, noting how Blake's audience seemed primed for entertainment rather than education. "I'm honored to be here," Seagal said simply, his voice carrying easily through the gym without any theatrical projection. "Blake invited me to share some thoughts on self-defense philosophy." Philosophy, exactly. Blake jumped on the word. "But first, let's show the chat what modern defensive techniques look like." He moved to the center of the mat, his body language shifting into performance mode. "This is how we handle real-world aggression in 2025. What followed was a display of flash over substance. High kicks, dramatic takedowns, and combinations that looked impressive but prioritized spectacle over practicality. Blake's technique was solid, but his presentation was pure theater, designed to maximize visual impact for the cameras. "Beautiful work," Seagal commented when Blake finished, his tone genuinely appreciative. "Strong technique, excellent conditioning." Blake's smile faltered slightly at the lack of defensive response. "Your turn, Mr. Seagal. Show us some of that Aikido flow." The trap was set. Blake's followers were expecting something to mock, something slow and impractical that would validate their modern sensibilities. Seagal moved to the center of the mat, and the gym fell silent. What happened next was nothing like what anyone expected. Seagal's movements were subtle, almost meditative. There were no dramatic flourishes, no aggressive displays of power. Instead, he demonstrated a series of redirections and controls that seemed to flow like water, each motion connected to the next in an unbroken sequence. His hands moved with surgical precision, showing how to neutralize attacks without causing unnecessary harm. "The goal isn't to destroy your opponent," Seagal explained quietly, his voice carrying an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "It's to end the conflict while preserving everyone's dignity." Blake watched with growing frustration. This wasn't the performance he'd expected. Where was the theatrical nonsense he could easily mock? Instead, he was witnessing something that looked deceptively simple but felt profoundly effective. "That's beautiful, Stephen, really," Blake said, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "But let's be honest, that works great in the movies, but what about real aggression? What about someone who really wants to hurt you?" The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet. Dev's camera captured the moment perfectly, Blake's aggressive posture, the anticipation in the watching crowd, and Seagal's unperturbed calm. "Would you like to demonstrate?" Seagal asked simply. Blake's eyes lit up. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. "Absolutely. Come at me like you mean it." What followed was a masterclass in misdirection. Blake launched forward with controlled aggression, his technique solid and his intent clear. But somehow, without any dramatic movement or obvious counter, he found himself gently guided past his target, his momentum redirected harmlessly away. From Seagal. "How did you?" Blake started, then stopped, his confusion evident. Again, Seagal said simply. Blake tried a different approach, then another. Each time, the result was the same. His attacks were neutralized not through force, but through redirection, timing, and an understanding of energy that seemed almost mystical. The live chat was going wild, but not in the way Blake had expected. Comments ranged from amazement to skepticism, with a growing number of viewers expressing genuine interest in what they were witnessing. "This is incredible," whispered Mike Santiago, who had been watching from the sidelines with absolute fascination. "He's not even trying to hurt him." Raina Brooks nodded slowly, her military training allowing her to appreciate the sophisticated mechanics of what she was seeing. "It's about controlling the situation, not dominating the opponent," she said quietly. "That's advanced thinking." Blake's frustration was mounting. This wasn't going according to plan. His audience was supposed to be laughing at outdated techniques, not marveling at their effectiveness. He decided to push harder. Okay, that's impressive," he said, forcing his performance smile back into place. "But let's be real, this is great for compliant partners. But what about multiple attackers? What about weapons?" "Those are excellent questions," Seagal replied. "Perhaps we could explore them in a more educational setting, with proper safety protocols." Blake's jaw tightened. The older man was refusing to be baited into a spectacle. instead treating every challenge as a teaching opportunity. It was simultaneously admirable and infuriating. "Come on, Stephen," Blake pushed, his voice carrying an edge that his followers would recognize as barely contained aggression. "Don't leave us hanging. Show us how that ancient art handles modern problems." The gym had gone quiet again. Yasmin watched from her office doorway, her expression unreadable. Lexi continued filming, her documentarian instincts recognizing that she was witnessing something significant, a collision between two different philosophies of strength and power. Seagal looked at Blake for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. But remember, the goal is always de-escalation." As they prepared for the next demonstration, Dev caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the camera monitor. The face looking back at him was troubled, uncertain. He'd known Blake for over a decade, had watched him build his empire from nothing. But this felt different, meaner, more calculated. The viewer count continued to climb, and the comments were becoming increasingly polarized. Some viewers were clearly there for the spectacle Blake had promised, while others seemed genuinely interested in what they were learning about martial arts philosophy. "Whatever happens next," Lexi whispered to herself as she adjusted her camera angle, "this story is about to take a turn." The third evening arrived with Mike Santiago practically vibrating with excitement. He'd spent the entire day at school talking about Steven Seagal's visit, much to his teacher's bemused annoyance. Now, as he changed into his training gear, he couldn't contain his enthusiasm. "You think he'll show us more of those moves?" Mike asked Reina as they prepared for the youth class. "The way he moved yesterday, it was like he was dancing with the attacks instead of fighting them." Reina smiled at the boy's description. "That's actually a very insightful way to put it, Mike. Maybe you should tell him that." The youth class was larger than usual, word having spread through the neighborhood about the legendary visitor. 12 kids ranging from 10 to 16 filled the training area, their usual boisterous energy tempered by anticipation. When Seagal arrived, dressed in a simple black GI, the room fell silent. "Good evening, everyone," Seagal said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had impressed the adults the night before. "I understand you've been working on self-defense techniques." Blake had positioned himself and Dev's camera at the edge of the mat, ostensibly to document the session, but clearly hoping for more content opportunities. His live stream from the previous night had garnered significant attention, though not all of it positive, and he was eager to capitalize on the momentum. "Mr. Seagal," piped up Marcus, a 14-year-old who was usually too cool to show enthusiasm for anything. "Is it true you can take down someone twice your size without hurting them?" Seagal considered the question seriously. Size and strength are factors, but they're not the only factors. Understanding leverage, timing, and energy can often be more important than raw power. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That sounds like fortune cookie wisdom," Blake muttered, just loud enough for his camera to catch. "Let's see some practical application." As if summoned by Blake's skepticism, a real-world situation presented itself. Two boys near the back of the group, Jamie, a stocky 15-year-old with a reputation for aggression, and Carlos, a smaller 13-year-old who was new to the gym, were having a heated argument over equipment. "I was using that bag." Jamie shoved Carlos hard, sending the smaller boy stumbling backward. "Find your own." Carlos, embarrassed and angry, clenched his fists and moved toward Jamie. The familiar dynamics of bullying were playing out in real time, and everyone in the room could feel the tension escalating. "Hey," Reina started to intervene, but Seagal held up a gentle hand. "May I?" he asked quietly. What happened next became the moment that would define everything that followed. Instead of physically separating the boys or raising his voice, Seagal simply moved between them, his presence somehow diffusing the immediate tension. "Jamie," he said calmly, "I can see you're frustrated. Carlos, you're angry. Both of those feelings are valid." The boys looked at him uncertainly, their aggressive postures beginning to soften. "But here's the thing about conflict," Seagal continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "The winner isn't the one who hits hardest or yells loudest. The winner is the one who finds a solution that lets everyone keep their dignity." He gestured to Carlos. "Show me how you would normally respond to being pushed." Carlos, still defensive, demonstrated a typical reaction, shoulders tensed, fists up, ready to swing at his aggressor. Natural response, Seagal nodded. Now let me show you something different. With infinite patience, Seagal guided Carlos through a simple redirection technique. When someone pushed, instead of pushing back, you moved with the energy, redirecting it harmlessly away while maintaining your own balance and composure. The attacker's energy becomes your tool, Seagal explained, demonstrating with gentle movements. You don't fight force with force. You redirect it. Mike Santiago watched, with absolute fascination, his young mind absorbing not just the physical technique, but the philosophy behind it. This wasn't about being weak or passive. It was about being smart, being in control. But what if they keep coming? Jamie asked, his earlier aggression replaced by genuine curiosity. Then you continue to redirect until they exhaust themselves. Or realize the futility of their approach, Seagal replied. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first response. He turned to the entire group, his voice carrying a gravitas that commanded attention. Each of you has the power to de-escalate any situation. The question is whether you choose to use that power or let your ego make the choice for you. Lexi's camera captured the moment perfectly. 12 young faces, all focused intently on this older man who was teaching them something far more valuable than how to throw a punch. She could see the shift in their postures, the way they leaned forward to catch every word. Blake, watching from the sidelines, felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. This wasn't the mockable performance he'd expected. This was actual teaching, actual wisdom being passed down. His followers were commenting positively on the stream, many expressing genuine interest in learning more about these techniques. Can you teach us more? Mike asked, his voice small but eager. Seagal smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since he'd arrived. Of course. But remember, the physical techniques are just the beginning. The real training is learning to control your emotions, your reactions, your need to prove something to others. For the next hour, Seagal worked with the kids, teaching them simple redirections, showing them how to create distance without creating enemies, demonstrating the power of calm presence in the face of aggression. Each lesson was practical, but underneath ran a deeper current of philosophy that seemed to resonate with the young students. When the class ended, the usual chaos of kids rushing to leave was replaced by a more subdued energy. Several students lingered, asking questions, wanting to know more. Mike Santiago approached Seagal with the shy reverence of a true admirer. "Mr. Seagal," he said quietly, "my uncle was right about you. You really are different." "Different how?" Seagal asked, kneeling down to the boy's level. "You don't need to prove anything to anybody. You just are." The simple profundity of the child's observation struck everyone within earshot. Lexi made sure her camera caught the moment. This 12-year-old boy articulating something that many adults struggled to understand. As the students filed out, their chatter was different from usual. Instead of discussing who was stronger or faster, they were talking about control, about redirecting energy, about the idea that true strength might look different from what they'd always imagined. Blake watched them go, his expression unreadable. Dev had stopped filming, sensing that something had shifted in the dynamic. The content they'd captured wasn't what Blake had planned, but it was undeniably powerful. That was. Raina began, then stopped, searching for words. Educational. Seagal finished simply. "Thank you for letting me share with them." As Seagal prepared to leave, Mike Santiago ran back into the gym, his face flushed with excitement and determination. "Mr. Seagal," he called out, "will you come back tomorrow? Please?" Seagal looked at the boy, then at the faces of the other adults watching the interaction. Something in the atmosphere had changed, something that went beyond the physical techniques or the philosophical discussions. "If it's helpful," he said finally, "I'd be honored to return." As he left that evening, the gym felt different. The same weights hung in their racks, the same bags hung from their chains, but something fundamental had shifted. A seed had been planted, not just in the minds of the young students, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the quiet power of redirection in action. The gym was quiet in the hours after closing, but the energy from the day's events still hummed in the air. Blake sat alone in his office, staring at the analytics from his livestream. The numbers were good, better than good, actually. Views were up, engagement was high, and his follower count had jumped significantly. But the comments weren't what he'd expected. "This old guy is actually legit," read one. "Why haven't I heard of aikido before?" read another. Blake seemed out of his depth here, NGL. That last comment stung more than Blake cared to admit. He'd built his entire brand on being the authority, the expert, the one who knew better than everyone else. But watching the footage back, he could see what his audience saw. Moments where he looked unsure, where Seagal's quiet confidence had made Blake's theatrical energy seem forced and hollow. A knock on his office door interrupted his brooding. Dev entered, carrying his camera equipment and wearing the expression Blake had learned to recognize as his friend's "we need to talk" face. "Good session today," Dev said carefully, setting down his gear. The kids really responded to him. "Yeah, sure," Blake muttered, still scrolling through comments. Nothing like a good lecture to get the blood pumping. Dev sat down across from his childhood friend, studying Blake's face. They'd known each other since they were Mike Santiago's age, had trained together, built this brand together. Dev knew when Blake was deflecting, and he knew when his friend was in pain. "Blake, man, what's really going on here? This isn't like you." "What do you mean?" Blake's voice carried a defensive edge. "I mean the setup, the cameras, the whole production. You invited this guy here to embarrass him, and it backfired. Now you're sitting here looking like someone stole your lunch money." Blake's jaw tightened. "I didn't invite him here to embarrass him. I invited him here to show the difference between what works and what doesn't. And what if what he does actually works?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Blake had spent years building his reputation on being the cutting edge, the evolution of martial arts into something practical and modern. The idea that an older approach might have value he hadn't considered was threatening to the very foundation of his identity. "Come on, Dev. You saw the same thing I did. Fancy movements, compliant partners, philosophical nonsense. It's not real, is it?" Dev reached for his camera, scrolling through the footage from the youth class. "Because what I saw was a bunch of kids who usually can't pay attention for 5 minutes hanging on every word. I saw Carlos and Jamie working together by the end of class instead of trying to beat each other up." Blake looked at the footage, and despite himself, he could see what Dev was talking about. There had been something different about the atmosphere, something that went beyond technique or philosophy. Down the hall, Raina Brooks was having her own moment of reflection. She'd stayed late to clean up the youth training area, but really, she was processing what she'd witnessed. Her military background had given her extensive training in combat systems, and she'd seen plenty of martial arts over the years. But Seagal's approach was unlike anything she'd encountered. She pulled out her phone and began researching, diving into articles and videos about aikido, about Seagal's background, about the philosophy behind the techniques they'd seen. What she found surprised her. Beyond the Hollywood persona and the internet memes, there was a legitimate martial artist with decades of experience and a teaching philosophy that resonated with her own understanding of conflict resolution. "Raina," Lexi's voice interrupted her research. The young documentarian was packing up her equipment, but she looked like she had something on her mind. "Hey, Lexi, what's up? Can I ask you something? As someone with actual combat experience, what did you think of what we saw today?" Raina considered the question carefully. "I think I saw something I've never seen before. Someone who had complete control without needing to demonstrate it. Someone who could end a conflict without creating an enemy." "That's what I thought, too," Lexi said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd stumbled onto something significant. "I've been editing the footage from the past few days, and there's a story here. A real story." "What kind of story?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think it's about what strength really means. And what happens when someone who understands that meets someone who doesn't." Back in Blake's office, the conversation had grown more heated. Dev had pulled up social media comments, showing Blake the range of responses to their content. "Look at this," Dev said, reading from his phone. "I came here to watch Blake roast some old guy, but now I'm actually interested in learning aikido." Or this one. Blake looked like he was trying too hard. The old guy didn't need to prove anything. "Since when do you care what the comments say?" Blake snapped. "Since I realized that maybe our audience is smarter than we give them credit for. Maybe they can tell the difference between someone who's performing and someone who's teaching." Blake stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, Brooklyn stretched away into the night, its lights twinkling like stars. He'd grown up in these streets, had fought his way out of poverty and anonymity through sheer force of will, and an unshakable belief in his own abilities. The idea that he might be wrong about something so fundamental was terrifying. "You think I'm a fake," he said quietly. "I think you're scared," Dev replied. "And I think you're letting that fear make you do things that aren't like you." What's that supposed to mean? The Blake I grew up with didn't need to tear other people down to build himself up. The Blake I knew was confident enough in his own abilities that he could learn from anyone. Dev's words hit harder than any physical blow. Blake remembered that younger version of himself, the one who'd been hungry to learn, who'd sought out every teacher and every technique that could make him better. When had that curiosity been replaced by the need to be right all the time? "I'm going to do something," Dev said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to delete the footage from yesterday. The mocking stuff, the setup, all of it." "Are you insane? Do you know how many views that got?" "I know exactly how many views it got, and I know it's not worth it." Blake watched his friend's face, seeing a determination there that he recognized from their childhood. The same look Dev had worn when he decided to stand up to bullies, regardless of the consequences. "What are you going to do instead?" "I'm going to edit together something that shows what actually happened. The teaching, the philosophy, the moment when those kids understood something they'd never understood before." As Blake processed this, Lexi appeared in the doorway, holding her camera. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to let you both know. I've been putting together a short documentary about the past few days, about what happens when different approaches to strength meet each other." "What's your angle?" Blake asked, his voice wary. "I'm not sure yet, but I think it's a story about learning. About what happens when someone who doesn't need to prove anything meets someone who's built their whole identity on proving everything." Blake looked at his two friends, at the equipment that had captured everything, at the comments still flowing in from viewers around the world. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely uncertain about what came next. "What if I've been wrong?" he asked quietly. "Then you learn," Dev said simply. "That's what growth looks like." As they prepared to leave the gym that night, each carrying their own questions and revelations, none of them knew that their story was about to reach far beyond the walls of BlitzMMA. Lexi's footage, Dev's editing, and Blake's crisis of confidence were about to create something that would challenge not just their own understanding of strength and teaching, but the assumptions of everyone who witnessed it. The stage was set for a transformation that would go far deeper than any physical technique or philosophical discussion. What had begun as a simple clash of egos was becoming something much more profound, a story about what it means to be strong, what it means to teach, and what it means to have the courage to change your mind. Saturday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the rain having washed Brooklyn clean overnight. Inside BlitzMMA, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had spread through social media and the local martial arts community. Something significant was happening at the gym, and people wanted to witness it firsthand. Yasmin had arrived early, her business instincts recognizing the opportunity. The gym was packed beyond capacity, with spectators lining the walls and dozens more watching the live stream that Dev had reluctantly agreed to broadcast. She'd framed it as a friendly demonstration between different martial arts philosophies, but everyone knew it was more than that. Blake stood in the center of the main mat, his usual pre-performance energy crackling around him like electricity. He'd spent the morning psyching himself up, reminding himself of his credentials, his victories, his superiority over outdated techniques. But underneath the bravado, Dev could see the tension in his friend's shoulders, the way his jaw was set just a little too tight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake announced to the crowd and cameras, "today we're going to settle an age-old debate. Traditional martial arts versus modern combat effectiveness. Theory versus reality." The crowd murmured with anticipation. Lexi positioned herself where she could capture multiple angles, her documentarian instincts telling her this moment would define everything that followed. Seagal entered the space with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all week. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance, just a man walking onto a mat to share his knowledge. He wore a simple black GI, his movements economical and purposeful as he bowed respectfully to Blake and the assembled crowd. "I'm honored to be here," Seagal said simply, his voice carrying easily through the packed gym. "The study of martial arts is a lifelong journey. We're all students." Blake's smile was predatory. "Absolutely. And today, we're all going to learn something." What followed was unlike anything the spectators had expected. Blake began with his usual high-energy demonstration, explosive combinations, dramatic takedowns, techniques designed to overwhelm opponents through speed and aggression. His athleticism was undeniable, his technique solid, his presentation perfectly calculated for maximum visual impact. The crowd responded with appropriate enthusiasm. This was what they'd come to see, modern martial arts in all its aggressive glory. "Your turn," Blake said, breathing hard from his exertions but grinning with confidence. Seagal nodded and moved to the center of the mat. What happened next was a masterclass in contrast. Where Blake had been all sharp angles and explosive movement, Seagal moved like water, fluid, continuous, seemingly effortless. His demonstrations weren't about overpowering opponents, but about redirecting their energy, using their own force against them. The crowd grew quieter as they watched, sensing something different in the quality of movement. This wasn't performance. This was something deeper, something that spoke to principles rather than techniques. "Beautiful," Blake said, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "But let's see how that works against real resistance." The challenge was issued, and the atmosphere in the gym shifted. This was no longer a demonstration, it was a test. They began slowly, Blake attacking with controlled aggression while Seagal responded with those flowing redirections. But as the intensity increased, something remarkable happened. No matter how hard Blake pushed, no matter how much speed or power he brought to bear, he couldn't land a clean technique on the older man. It wasn't that Seagal was faster or stronger. It was that he seemed to exist in a different relationship with the conflict itself. Where Blake fought against resistance, Seagal moved with it. Where Blake sought to overcome, Seagal sought to redirect. The crowd watched in growing amazement as Blake's frustration mounted. His techniques were solid, his athleticism superior, but somehow he couldn't connect with his target. It was like trying to punch water. "This is incredible," whispered Mike Santiago, who had pressed close to the mat despite Reina's attempts to keep the kids back. "He's not even trying to hurt him." Reina nodded, her military training allowing her to appreciate the sophisticated mechanics of what she was witnessing. "He's controlling the entire engagement without being aggressive. That's advanced thinking." Blake's breathing was becoming labored, his movements more desperate. He'd built his entire reputation on being the dominant force in any physical confrontation. But this quiet man was dismantling that identity without throwing a single aggressive technique. "Enough." Blake suddenly stepped back, his chest heaving. "This isn't how real fights work." The gym fell silent. Everyone could feel the shift in energy, the way Blake's frustration had boiled over into something uglier. "In a real fight," Blake continued, his voice rising, "there are no compliant partners. There are no philosophical discussions. There's just violence, and whoever handles it better wins." Seagal regarded him calmly. "And what do you think we've been doing?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Blake had been bringing real aggression, real technique, real intent to overcome his opponent. And he'd been consistently, gently neutralized. "This is bullshit," Blake muttered, turning away from the mat. "This isn't martial arts. This is dance. Class." As Blake walked toward the edge of the mat, the crowd remained silent. They'd witnessed something unprecedented, a master craftsman demonstrating his art, only to have it dismissed by someone who couldn't understand what he'd seen. Seagal remained in the center of the mat, his composure unchanged. "The door is always open," he said quietly, his words carrying to every corner of the gym. "Learning requires only willingness." Blake paused at the edge of the mat, his back to the crowd. For a moment, everyone thought he might turn around, might acknowledge what had just happened. Instead, he continued walking, disappearing into the locker room without another word. The demonstration was over, but the real education was just beginning. The locker room door slammed with enough force to rattle the entire frame. Blake stood alone among the metal lockers, his chest heaving not from exertion, but from something deeper, a rage mixed with confusion that he'd never experienced before. In the mirror across from him, he saw a man he didn't recognize, red-faced, disheveled, and utterly lost. Outside, the gym buzzed with animated conversations as spectators tried to process what they'd witnessed. Dev had stopped the livestream, his finger hovering over the delete button as he wrestled with what to do with the footage. The comments had been unlike anything he'd seen. Not the usual mockery and trolling, but genuine discussion about technique, philosophy, and the nature of martial arts itself. That was, Yasmin began, then stopped, searching for words that could capture the complexity of what had unfolded. Transformative, Lexi finished, her camera still rolling as she captured the crowd's reactions. I've never seen anything like it. Reina was fielding questions from the youth students, who had watched the demonstration with wide eyes and were now full of questions about what they'd witnessed. Mike Santiago tugged at her sleeve insistently. Ms. Brooks, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Why was Mr. Blake so angry? Mr. Seagal wasn't trying to hurt him. The innocent question cut to the heart of what everyone was thinking, but few were willing to voice. Reina knelt down to the boy's level, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes, she said, people get frustrated when they realize they don't understand something as well as they thought they did. Meanwhile, Seagal was quietly gathering his things, seemingly unaffected by the drama swirling around him. Several spectators approached him with questions, but he answered each one with the same patient attention he'd shown throughout the week. Mr. Seagal called out one of the older men who'd been watching from the sidelines. I've been doing martial arts for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just demonstrated. How do you recommend someone my age start learning aikido? The same way anyone starts learning anything, Seagal replied simply, with an open mind and a willingness to be wrong about what you think you know. The comment wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but everyone in earshot understood the implication. Learning required humility, something that had been in short supply during the demonstration. Back in the office, Dev finally made his decision. Instead of deleting the footage, he began editing it, but not in the way Blake would have expected. He cut out the inflammatory comments, the setup, the moments where Blake had tried to manufacture controversy. Instead, he focused on the teaching moments, the quiet demonstrations of technique, the philosophical discussions that had preceded the physical confrontation. Lexi found him hunched over his laptop, headphones on, completely absorbed in his work. What are you doing? She asked. Trying to tell the truth, Dev replied without looking up. For once in my life, I'm going to put out content that actually matters. What about Blake? What about your friendship? Dev paused, finally meeting her eyes. Blake is my best friend. That's exactly why I can't keep enabling this. He's better than what he showed out there, and deep down, he knows it. As if summoned by their conversation, Blake emerged from the locker room, his face a mask of forced composure. He'd changed clothes and slicked back his hair, but the turmoil in his eyes was unmistakable. Dev, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I need you to delete that footage. All of it. I can't do that. What do you mean you can't? It's your camera, your editing software. Just delete it. Dev closed his laptop and looked at his childhood friend. Blake, what happened out there wasn't what you think it was. What I think is that some old guy got lucky with a few parlor tricks, and now everyone's acting like he's some kind of prophet. That's not what happened, and you know it. Blake's carefully maintained composure cracked. I know that I've spent 10 years building something real, something that actually works, and now people are ready to throw it all away because some washed-up actor can make a few pretty movements. Is that really what you think happened? The question came from Reina, who had appeared in the doorway. Behind her stood several of the youth students, including Mike Santiago, who looked at Blake with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. I think, Blake said, his voice rising, that everyone's forgotten what real martial arts look like. Real training. Real results. And what do real results look like? Reina asked quietly. Blake gestured toward the gym, where his accomplishments hung on the walls in the form of tournament photos and championship belts. They look like wins. They look like dominance. They look like being better than everyone else. Is that what you taught us? Mike asked, his young voice cutting through the tension. Because Mr. Seagal said the goal wasn't to be better than everyone else. He said the goal was to be better than you were yesterday. The boy's words hit Blake like a physical blow. He'd spent years teaching these kids, had watched them grow and develop, had taken pride in their progress. Now they were looking at him like he was a stranger, like everything he'd taught them was somehow inadequate. You kids don't understand, Blake said, his voice carrying a desperate edge. This is about more than philosophy. This is about survival, about being strong enough to protect yourself and the people you care about. But Mr. Seagal was stronger. Mike replied with devastating simplicity. He was stronger because he didn't need to prove it. Blake stared at the boy, then at Raina, then at Dev. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing: disappointment, pity, the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in how they saw him. Fine, he said finally. Believe whatever you want. But don't come crying to me when your pretty philosophy meets real violence. He turned to leave, but Yasmin blocked his path. She'd been watching the entire exchange from her office doorway, her business owner's instincts warring with her deeper understanding of what was happening. Blake, she said quietly, maybe you should take some time to think about this. Think about what? About what you saw out there. About what it means. About whether your ego is more important than your growth. Blake looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, everyone thought he might break down completely. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and pushed past her. I know exactly what I saw, he said, and I know exactly what it means. It means I'm surrounded by people who are ready to abandon everything we've built for the sake of some mystical nonsense. As he walked away, the gym fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't respectful. It was the silence of people, watching someone they cared about make a choice that would define everything that came after. The gym was empty except for the emergency lighting and the sound of Blake's fists hitting the heavy bag in an endless, punishing rhythm. It was past midnight, but he couldn't bring himself to go home. Home meant being alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts were a battlefield he wasn't winning. Each punch was harder than the last, his technique deteriorating as emotion took over. Blood seeped through his hand wraps, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The physical pain was easier to understand than the chaos in his mind. You're going to hurt yourself. Blake spun around to find Seagal standing in the doorway, still wearing the same clothes from earlier, but somehow managing to look unruffled despite the day's events. What are you doing here? Blake's voice was hoarse from exhaustion. I saw the lights on. Thought someone might need help. Blake laughed bitterly. Help? Right. Come to finish what you started? Seagal moved closer, his movements still carrying that same fluid grace that had so frustrated Blake earlier. I'm not your enemy, Blake. Aren't you? You came into my gym, humiliated me in front of my students, my friends, my audience. You destroyed everything I've built. Blake's voice cracked on the last words. I taught some techniques. You made it into something else. The simple statement hit harder than any accusation could have. Blake sank onto a bench, his head in his hands. The fight went out of him all at once, leaving only exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to despair. You want to know what really happened out there? Blake said without looking up. I got beat by a 70-year-old man who wasn't even trying, in front of everyone who's ever looked up to me. Seagal sat down beside him, the bench creaking under their combined weight. Is that what you think this was about? Winning and losing? What else would it be about? Learning, growing, understanding that there's always more to discover. Blake finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Easy for you to say. You're the legend. I'm just the guy who got schooled by the legend. You know what I see when I look at you? Seagal asked. I see someone who spent so much time being afraid of being weak that he's forgotten what real strength looks like. I'm not afraid of anything. Then why are you here at midnight, bleeding onto a heavy bag instead of at home with people who care about you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Blake wanted to deny it, to maintain the facade of control that had served him for so long. Instead, he found himself remembering. I was 17, he said quietly. Regional MMA tournament. I was supposed to be the next big thing, you know? All the coaches said I had everything. Technique, heart, the killer instinct. Seagal listened without interrupting, his presence somehow making it easier to continue. Third round, I was ahead on points. All I had to do was not get caught. Then this kid, smaller than me, quieter than me, he caught me with something I never saw coming. One moment I was winning, the next I was waking up on the mat with everyone staring at me. Blake's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I never fought competitively again. Told everyone it was because I wanted to focus on teaching, on building something bigger. But the truth is, I was terrified of feeling that helpless again. And so you built a world where you could control everything, Seagal said. Where you were always the expert, always the one with the answers. It worked. For 10 years, it worked. I had respect, influence, success. People looked up to me. And now, Blake gestured helplessly at the empty gym. Now I'm the guy who got embarrassed by techniques I don't understand, teaching philosophy I can't argue with, by someone who didn't even need to try. You think I didn't try? The question surprised Blake. Did you? I tried harder then. You know, not to defeat you, but to show you something you needed to see. The hardest part wasn't redirecting your attacks. It was doing it in a way that preserved your dignity. Blake stared at him. You were holding back. I was teaching. There's a difference. For a long moment, they sat in silence, surrounded by the equipment that had defined Blake's identity for so long. Finally, Blake spoke. I don't know how to be wrong about something this important. The same way you learn anything else. One mistake at a time. Blake felt something shift inside him. Not the dramatic transformation of a movie moment, but the small, quiet recognition that his world hadn't ended. It had just gotten bigger. What do I do now, he asked. What do you want to do? I want to understand what happened today. I want to know why your way worked when mine didn't. I want to. He paused, the words difficult to say. I want to learn. Seagal nodded slowly. Then we start there. As they sat together in the empty gym, Blake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The excitement of being a beginner again, of having more questions than answers, of discovering that there was still so much he didn't know. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 weeks later, BlitzMMA looked the same from the outside, but everything had changed within its walls. The transformation had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but now it was undeniable. The gym's culture had shifted from competition to collaboration, from proving superiority to exploring possibility. Blake stood in the center of the youth training area, but his role had fundamentally changed. Instead of being the unquestioned authority, he was now part of a teaching partnership with Seagal, learning alongside his students rather than simply instructing them. Remember, Seagal said to a group of 8 young students, the goal isn't to win the encounter. It's to transform it. Blake watched as Mike Santiago, who had become something of a star pupil, demonstrated a redirection technique with one of the older kids. The boy's understanding of the principles was intuitive, natural, and Blake found himself genuinely impressed by the progress. Mike, Blake called out, show them how you'd handle someone who keeps pushing after you've redirected them. The boy's face lit up with the confidence of someone who finally understood something important. You keep redirecting, but you also create distance. Mr. Seagal taught me that space is your friend. It gives you options. Blake nodded approvingly. Exactly. And what are those options? You can de-escalate, you can leave, or if you absolutely have to, you can respond with just enough force to stop the threat, but only as a last resort. Perfect. Blake felt a genuine warmth at the boy's understanding. This was what teaching was supposed to feel like, not the performance of superiority, but the sharing of knowledge that empowered others. Reina had fully embraced the new approach, integrating aikido principles into her military combatives training. The fusion was creating something neither purely traditional nor purely modern, but something entirely practical. It's about reading the situation, she explained to a group of adult students. Understanding that every confrontation has multiple layers: physical, psychological, emotional. If you can address the real root of the conflict, you often don't need to fight at all. Dev had been documenting the transformation, his camera capturing not just the physical techniques, but the change in atmosphere. Where there had once been tension and competition, there was now curiosity and mutual support. This is incredible footage, Lexi said, reviewing his work. You can actually see the moment when students stop trying to prove themselves and start trying to understand. It's been weird, Dev admitted. I've been filming Blake for years, but I've never seen him this centered. Like he's finally comfortable in his own skin. Yasmin had been watching the changes with the calculating eye of a business owner, but also with the deeper satisfaction of someone who recognized quality when she saw it. The gym's membership had actually increased since the incident, as word spread about the unique approach being developed at BlitzMMA. We're getting inquiries from other martial arts schools, she told Seagal during one of their weekly check-ins. People want to know if we'll franchise this approach. What do you think? Seagal asked. I think we're onto something special here, but I also think it only works if it's authentic. If it becomes just another marketing gimmick, we'll lose what makes it valuable. Seagal nodded approvingly. Wisdom. The moment you try to package enlightenment, you lose it. The most dramatic change had been in Blake himself. Gone was the performative bravado, the need to dominate every conversation and situation. In its place was something quieter but more substantial, the confidence that came from genuine competence, rather than manufactured superiority. "I have something to show you," he told Seagal after one of their evening sessions. He pulled out his phone and navigated to his social media accounts. "I've been rebuilding my online presence." Instead of the aggressive, ego-driven content that had made him famous, Blake's new videos focused on teaching moments, philosophical discussions, and genuine technique breakdowns. The comments were different too, less trolling, more thoughtful. Engagement. "This is the content I've been waiting for," he read aloud. "Finally, someone who cares more about sharing knowledge than showing off." Or this one. "Blake's transformation has been inspiring to watch. This is what growth looks like." Seagal smiled, one of his rare, genuine expressions of pleasure. "How does it feel?" "Different. Harder in some ways, because I can't just rely on flash and controversy. But also, more satisfying. Like I'm building something that might actually last." "And the student numbers?" Blake's grin was boyish, nothing like his old predatory smile. "Up 30%. Turns out people respond to authenticity." As they prepared to close the gym for the evening, Mike Santiago approached them with the serious expression he wore when he had something important to say. "Mr. Blake, Mr. Seagal," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you for teaching me that being strong doesn't mean being mean." Blake knelt down to the boy's level, his own expression serious. "What do you mean by that, Mike?" "I mean that before, I thought I had to be tough all the time, you know? Like, show everyone I couldn't be pushed around. But now I know that real strength is being able to choose how to respond. That's way cooler than just hitting people." Blake looked up at Seagal, who was watching the interaction with quiet satisfaction. "Yeah, kid, that is way cooler." As they walked toward the exit, Blake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of a day well spent, of knowledge shared rather than hoarded, of connections made rather than competitions won. "Thank you," he said quietly to Seagal. "For what?" "For showing me that there was another way. For not giving up on me even when I gave up on myself." Seagal paused at the door, his hand on the light switch. "You did the hardest part, Blake. You chose to learn. Everything else was just technique." As they stepped out into the Brooklyn evening, the gym dark behind them, Blake realized that for the first time in years, he was genuinely excited about tomorrow. Not because he had something to prove, but because he had something to discover. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. The converted warehouse space in downtown Brooklyn hummed with anticipation as folding chairs filled with familiar faces from BlitzMMA. The makeshift screening room smelled of coffee and nervous energy, while rain drummed against the tall windows. Lexi Rivera stood at the front, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone clipped to her vintage blazer. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "What started as a simple documentation project became something I never expected. This is the master who didn't need to win." The lights dimmed, and the first image flickered on the small screen. Steven Seagal entering the gym 3 weeks ago, quiet and unassuming in his dark trench coat. The audience, Blake, Raina, Dev, Yasmin, little Mike and his parents, several regular gym members, watched in silence as the story unfolded. Lexi's editing had transformed the raw footage into something profound. The contrast between Blake's brash livestream mockery and Seagal's measured responses created a visual narrative that spoke without words. She'd captured the subtle moments. The way Seagal's eyes never showed anger, even when Blake's taunts grew louder. The gentle precision of his movements when teaching little Mike. The quiet dignity in his silence. The most powerful sequence showed Blake's breakdown alongside Seagal's unwavering compassion. No narration was needed. The footage spoke for itself. Blake's face tightened as he watched his former self on screen, seeing clearly for the first time how desperate and hollow his performance had been. "I can't watch this," Blake whispered to Dev, but he couldn't look away. The camera had caught everything. Blake's tearful confession in the locker room, Seagal's patient listening, the awkward first steps of Blake's transformation. But Lexi had edited it with such care that it never felt exploitative. Instead, it felt like hope. When the final scene played, Seagal quietly teaching a combined aikido and MMA class while Blake assisted with humble attention. The room fell into profound silence. The credits rolled over a quote from Seagal. True strength is knowing when not to use it. The lights came up slowly. Several people wiped their eyes. Little Mike's mother reached over and squeezed his shoulder. Yasmin sat back in her chair, visibly moved. I owe everyone an apology, Yasmin said, standing slowly. Her voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. I let toxic behavior flourish in my gym because it brought in views and revenue. I enabled a culture that mocked wisdom and celebrated ego. She turned toward the back of the room where Seagal sat quietly, having arrived unnoticed during the opening credits. Stephen, I'm sorry. You showed us what leadership actually looks like. Seagal nodded but said nothing, his presence as understated as always. Blake rose next, his voice thick with emotion. I spent years building a brand around tearing people down. I thought confidence meant making others feel small. He looked directly at Seagal. You could have destroyed me that day. Physically, mentally, socially. You had every right. Instead, you chose to help me rebuild something real. His voice cracked. I don't know how to thank you for that. The crowd began to applaud, but Seagal raised a gentle hand. The thanks belong to all of you, he said simply. You chose to change. That's not easy work. Little Mike stood up, his voice carrying the earnestness only a 12-year-old can muster. Mr. Seagal, you taught me that being tough isn't about fighting. It's about helping people feel safe. The room erupted in genuine applause this time. Reina wiped tears from her eyes. I've been training for 15 years, and I learned more about martial arts in 3 weeks with you than in the previous decade. As the crowd began to mingle, sharing stories and emotions, Lexi found herself surrounded by people asking about her documentary. A woman in a sharp blazer introduced herself as a programming director from a documentary film festival. This is exactly the kind of storytelling we need, she said, handing Lexi a business card. Have you considered expanding this into a feature-length piece? But Lexi's eyes kept drifting to Seagal, who stood quietly by the window, watching the rain. He seemed to be preparing to leave, as he always did, without fanfare, without needing the last word. Blake approached him one final time. Will you stay? Help us build something that lasts. Seagal smiled, the first full smile anyone had seen from him. You don't need me anymore. You have everything you need right here. He gestured around the room at the transformed community. This is your dojo now. Make it worthy of the trust these young people place in you. As the evening wound down, Seagal moved toward the exit. The crowd was too engaged in conversation to notice exactly how he preferred it. His work here was complete. 3 weeks later, the morning light filtered through the newly installed windows of BlitzMMA, casting long shadows across the transformed space. The aggressive neon signage had been replaced with simple, elegant lettering. BlitzMMA, Path of Peace Training Center. A small wooden plaque near the entrance read, dedicated to the masters who teach through example. Thank you, Steven Seagal. Little Mike arrived early, as he had every day since the documentary premiere. His backpack was lighter now, not because he carried fewer books, but because he carried less fear. The bullying at school had stopped, not because he'd learned to fight, but because he'd learned to move through the world with quiet confidence. Blake was already on the mats, moving through the slow, deliberate forms that Seagal had taught him. His movements lacked the flash and aggression of his old routine, but they carried something deeper: purpose, balance, respect. The livestream, set up in the corner, remained unused. Blake had discovered that the most important audience was the one standing in front of him. Morning, Mike, Blake called out, his voice warm and unhurried. Ready for class? The youth program had evolved into something beautiful. Reina had seamlessly integrated aikido principles into practical self-defense training, creating a curriculum that emphasized de-escalation and redirection over aggression. The kids learned to defend themselves, but more importantly, they learned to defend others and when to walk away. Mr. Blake, Mike asked, adjusting his GI. Do you think Mr. Seagal will come back? Blake paused his kata, considering the question. I don't think he needs to. He gave us everything we need to carry on without him. At the back of the gym, Lexi set up her camera for what would be her final documentation session. The grant money had come through. She would be spending the next year creating a feature-length documentary about martial arts philosophy in the modern world. This gym would be her case study, but she wanted to capture one more moment: the ordinary magic of a transformed space. Dev entered with a coffee for Blake and a juice box for Mike, his new routine since becoming the gym's community outreach coordinator. The toxic livestream culture had died a natural death, replaced by something more sustainable: genuine connection and growth. 10 minutes until class starts, Dev announced, but his voice carried none of the frantic energy of his previous role. He'd found peace in being useful rather than viral. Yasmin emerged from her office, reviewing the morning schedule. The membership numbers had initially dropped when Blake stopped the controversial content, but they'd stabilized at a healthier level. The members who remained were there for the right reasons, and word was spreading through the community about the gym's transformed culture. Raina's bringing the new kids today, Yasmin announced. The ones from the community center. Blake smiled. They'd started a scholarship program for at-risk youth, funded partly by the gym's profits and partly by donations from people who'd seen Lexi's documentary. It wasn't about charity, it was about opportunity. As the morning class began, the energy in the room was unlike the old days. There was focus without aggression, intensity without ego. Blake guided the students through combination drills that seamlessly blended traditional martial arts with practical self-defense, always emphasizing control and respect. "Remember," Blake said, his voice carrying the patient authority he'd learned from Seagal, "the goal isn't to win. The goal is to end the conflict safely for everyone involved." Little Mike paired with a new student, a shy girl named Isabella who'd been struggling with confidence. Mike's patient guidance, a mirror of what Seagal had shown him, helped her find her footing both literally and figuratively. Outside, the Brooklyn morning was crisp and clear. At the corner coffee shop 2 blocks away, Steven Seagal sat quietly, with his usual black coffee, reading a worn copy of The Art of War. He could hear the distant sounds of training drifting from the gym, but he made no move to approach. A young barista, recognizing him from the documentary that had been making rounds on social media, approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, aren't you?" Seagal looked up calmly. "Just a man having coffee," he said with a gentle smile. "That thing you did at the gym," the barista continued, "that was really cool. Teaching instead of fighting." Seagal nodded. "The best teachers are the ones who make themselves unnecessary." He finished his coffee, left exact change with a generous tip, and walked out into the morning. His trench coat flapped slightly in the breeze as he moved down the sidewalk with the same measured pace he'd always maintained. Behind him, the sounds of training continued. Young voices calling out techniques, the soft thud of bodies hitting mats safely, the quiet instruction of teachers who'd learned that real strength came from lifting others up. Steven Seagal disappeared around the corner, his work complete. He'd entered their world like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples that would extend far beyond what any of them could imagine. The gym would go on without him. The students would grow and teach others, and the cycle would continue. The path of peace had many travelers, but it needed no single guide. As he walked toward the subway, Seagal pulled out his phone and deleted the contact information for BlitzMMA. He wouldn't be back, and that was exactly as it should be. Some lessons are only learned when the teacher walks away. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.